Welcome to Win the Day with Wasson, presented by Market Scale in partnership with WTD Consulting. Let's deep dive into the principles and perspectives that have shaped the winning mindsets with our guests focused on driving people performance. Confident our guests can help you unlock the coveted it factor that we believe is a learnable trait enabling the separation for success in a world of human commoditization. I'd like to welcome our Win the Day community. What a treat you are in for today. We've had guests of Olympians, athletes, doctors. We've never had cancer survivors. We've never had the man that pretty much invented the double Windsor, a former NFL great, an 8-time NFL veteran, and really privileged and honored to have Merril Hoge join Win the Day with Wasson. Merril, welcome.
Good to be with you, my friend.
Well, we're glad to have you, Merril. And for our community, Merril, that really doesn't know your story and doesn't know really the ins and outs of you always, no pun intended, finding a way, we're going to really deep dive into your story that's created, not only an inspiration to many, a cancer survivor, but Merril, I want to take it back to when you're in small state Idaho, not known for producing tremendous athletes like yourself. But for our audience, Merril, give us a little bit of background about really what created the mindset and the vision that ultimately you're living out today. But let's walk back to your time at Idaho in the early days of Merril.
Well, I have to paint a picture. This started around 1973. I was 8 years old. And there's not people that weren't around in 1973. It helps them understand the perspective of 1973. And people who were around in 1973 will identify with it. But my dad was a milkman. And this is, well, let me back up just before that. When I was 8 years old, I was asked, what do you want to do when you grow up? I got asked that for the very first time. And I remember having no idea. And I wasn't frustrated by it. In fact, I was intrigued by it. And that's actually what got my wheels spinning and thinking, like, what do I want to do? What would I want to be? And my dad was a milkman. This is how you used to get your milk back in 1973. People left their bottles of milk into a container on the porch. My dad get up at 4:30 in the morning, and his route that's how you got milk. You didn't go to the grocery store. He would be the guy who dropped your milk off, gave you two new bottles of milk, took the empty ones on his way. And in 1973, not everybody had televisions. So, and if you did, it was a box about yay big. There was an antenna, 2 knobs, 3 channels. There's no remote. So whatever channel you selected, you had to be comfortable with that before you went on the couch. Now, if your parents come in, well, you are the remote. So that was irrelevant. But it kind of gives you an idea of, what access we had at that time from a TV perspective. Because of the access we have today, sometimes it's hard to understand this. So I had never seen football on television. And it was actually shortly after being told or asked what I wanted to do, I saw my grandparents. I'll back up. On Sundays, we could not have any television on. So I used to love to go to my grandparents' house because they always had their television on. And it was shortly after being asked this, I walked in and there it was. I'd never seen football on television. And I've been doing that in the backyard with my friends. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that's what I want to do. And so fast forwarding, there was something else I used to hear a lot when I was a kid. I used to hear, write your goals down, put them in your bedroom. It's where you start and end your day. Great idea. But I have a problem. I got a little brother and a bunk bed. And I tried to put a goal up one day and it got torn down. So that wasn't going to work. So I tried to pray diligently. I actually prayed diligently every night that one or both would disappear so I could have my own bedroom. It doesn't mean I didn't love my little brother. But I eventually get my own room. And what I asked my dad to make is a wall of cork. Like, I didn't want a cork board. I wanted an entire wall because I wanted to put my goals up. I thought it was a fantastic idea. I thought that would really be, it's what I needed at that time based on the goal that I had. And so my dad makes me a wall of cork. I actually pinned that goal up. I will play in the National Football League, how I wrote it out. I put it in big letters, had cards about this big, and I had a Pittsburgh Steelers were my favorite team. Walter Payton was my favorite player. I had a picture of him. And this is where the moment of truth happens. I call it a moment of truth in life, but it was actually my first time in my life I ever self-reflected. I made a commitment. As I looked at that goal, I started thinking about all the things people had said to me to that point, and things like, oh, how hard that is. Do you know what the odds are? Don't put all your eggs in a basket, or it was impossible. every time I got asked, what do you want to do? And I tell them I'd get one of those 4 things. And that's why I see things through a child's eyes, maybe more than most adults, because the people who are supposed to encourage me were the first ones to discourage me. But it speaks to resiliency of young people, and it speaks to probably one of the things I talk about when I speak. When I travel and I speak, I really make sure I emphasize this, that we all have a choice in life. Do you want to build a life of resiliency or a life of regret? And that was my first moment in truth in my life where I chose to build a life of resiliency. And I was looking at that goal while playing the NFL, and the words "find a way" pop into my head. And the second I say that today, it's still the same energy as I got then. I light up about that. I get excited about that because it sparks me to do one thing: do something about my circumstance, take action. So at the end of the day, everybody can do that. But that's not difficult. It's the commitment to it every day that you have to make to yourself. And it's that constant self-reflection. You have to look in the mirror and go, okay, am I doing my part? Am I getting everything out of my God-given ability? I think one of the most rewarding things we can give to ourselves is to get everything out of our God-given abilities. And that doesn't mean you're going to be the greatest of all time. It might. But to have peace with looking in the mirror and going, I did my part. There's a great reward in life. And it's a reward of peace and joy and happiness and success. It's not an award. Nobody's going to give you an award and go, hey, great job. But you can be rewarded by things like that. And that's where the journey began. And obviously everything has evolved from that. But that's when those words really resonated with me. They still do today. They sit over there on that wall. Now I do have a cork board. I don't have a wall now, but it's the foundation of what I speak on and how I try to leave people with looking at themselves. Because I tell people, when I get done speaking, if they're talking about me, I did a bad job. But if they're thinking about themselves and really what they possess, the energies they have and what they're in charge of and control of, then I've done a good job, is to get them to self-reflect themselves and start looking at things. And hey, if they open themselves up and they go, I'm not doing my part. Well, that's a great time to change. That's a great time to make some different changes, take a different course, take action and move on, and that's what it's about. Life's a team game, and I love just being a part of the team and helping people who might be searching for stuff at any given moment.
Well, I love that, Merril, and no one better to, number one, be able to self-reflect and visualize, but create realization from that visualization. And it sounds like from an early age, that passion that you continue to have is really what propelled you into becoming, what we all know you as today. But kind of through that journey, I know you've had different trials and tribulations and adverse situations that you've gone through. But, let's walk back. Merril, you obviously had a tremendous high school career. You were a very gifted athlete. You chose to stay in state and be an Idaho State Bengal, where you set the world on fire. But what were some kind of life lessons you learned in the locker room as a, emerging star as you started your career at Idaho State?
Well, I will tell you this, the locker room to me, the locker room and the huddle are the two most important aspects of football. I tell people all the time, let's use the huddle, for example. People think you call plays there, which is true. The play is called there. But the conversations and the things that go on in the huddle are what helps you win games. It's what makes you make little adjustments to the play that's just been called or sent in that make the difference in winning a game. And that's about, communication. I'm a product of a lot of people. By no stretch of the imagination have I done this by myself at any given point. I find hope in people. I continue to do that. I'm inspired by people. Walter Payton gave me hope when I was a kid that you could play in the National Football League. Aristotle's words inspired me. I talked to 5 people that had been through what I'm about to go through after I get diagnosed with cancer. As brutal as it was, and they shared it with me, I found hope in them. And I find hope in all kinds of scenarios. But going back to the huddle and the locker room, that's when you find out about people. Listen, when it's 1st and 10, they call a play in. It's the first play of the game. Everybody can do that. It's when it's 4th and 1 and there's 1 second left on the clock and you got to get 2 yards in order to win, what goes on in that huddle and how people respond, the things that are communicated then, those are the things that matter. And those actually do translate to life. Like football is a great example, and sports are, of building resiliency and the things that you develop that transition out into the real world. And I've always had value in that. I think and reflect back more on things that happened in the huddle, things that happened in the locker room. You learn about people. One thing I love about football and sports, we stand in the huddle, whether I'm a Bear or I'm a Steeler, like everybody comes from different backgrounds, races, religion, all those things. But man, you're a Pittsburgh Steeler when you're in that huddle. And that's how you look at everybody. And that's what I love about sports. All those other things go by the wayside and you join as a team, and you fight for the guy next to you. You do your job because you have responsibility to yourself, one, but then you have responsibility to the team, and learning those things and then learning about people, seeing things through their eyes versus your eyes, and learning where they came from versus where you came from, and being able to do those things and evolve as a person is probably one of the things I've loved most about sports, especially football, that has taught me.
Well, you definitely left your mark, and I'll say even myself, Merril, as a former, Division I athlete, I wasn't quite man enough like you to carry the rock and tote the pill at the running back position. I was more of a quarterback and receiver at Texas State University and OU. But I will tell you, those life lessons even translate into the corporate world. So the things you speak about, that 4th and 1, that competitive mentality, that willingness to really, put yourself and team on the line when it matters most, I think are very translatable traits that you take from football to really any aspect of life. So really appreciate you sharing that, with our audience. So let's fast forward. So not only did you, enter in Idaho State is probably somewhat of an unknown commodity. You exited Idaho State as, quite frankly, and even still, an NCAA record holder. I think you finished at one point with 2,113 all-purpose yards, nearly 200 yards a game. I know individual statistics don't define you, Merril, but I think you talked about this. The people around you help put you in a position to win. Can you comment on, the relationship side of football and how, your teammates impacted not only your performance, but how you're using that type of mindset now as you talk to others around the importance of leveraging relationships and relying on people to drive success?
Yeah, well, I towards the end of every presentation, I do make the reference to, football is the greatest team sport that I have ever played, but life is the greatest team game, and individually we're strong, collectively we're powerful. Well, that is true in sports, because I was a running back, as you mentioned. Okay. If you don't block anybody, I'm just going to be so good. Okay. There's just only so much I can do. But man, when 10 other guys do their job, and help me, I'm a much better player. I just, I didn't block it. The many games where I've had 100 yards rushing, a couple touchdowns, and I'm like, I never blocked a soul. I didn't block one soul, so somebody did a lot for me to be successful on that day. And it's really true in life. I speak on a lot of corporate events, and I tell you, I always find some value at every event that I go to. Somebody shares something with me, or I learn something about a company. I learn something about, what makes successful companies, what makes peaceful, successful people, and peaceful, successful companies. And I throw peace in there because there's always two things that come to the top. Of all the things that we spoke, I already spoke of resiliency. I think that's one of the most vital components that can be taught and learned actually in the youth level, which is one of the most valuable aspects of sports for our kids. Why kids need to be involved in activities and sports, especially you learn that from sports from that perspective. But the two things always rise to the top of all the things that I have learned personally. And then as you talk to other successful people and companies, one is integrity. And the way I've looked at integrity, like everybody gets exposed for integrity at some point. We all get exposed, right? It's better to be exposed for having it than not having it. And that actually leads me to the second one, which I've kind of already talked about, which is the most vital aspect of how we grow and how we evolve, the ability to self-reflect. as good as you might be, as smart as you might be, um, as comfortable as you might be where you're going, the ability to open yourself up and ask questions and check on yourself, like, am I doing my part? Is there more I can be doing? Is there more I should be doing? And those answers that you get from yourself, it's a chance to make corrections and take the proper action. It's not the opportunity to make excuses. And when we can do those type of things, that's how we grow. That's how we evolve in life is the ability to do that, to accept, hey, I don't know everything, and listen to people, take on a challenge, and grow from that. I have not met a person or a company that hasn't done that, and they don't do that on a consistent basis. And I just think it's refreshing. I mean, I've done that for a long time. And I'll say this right off the bat. It's not easy sometimes. You get comfortable and you're like, I'm good. And then somebody throws something your way and you're like, I think I know enough on that. But then you think, wait a minute, time out. And then you open yourself up to it. I'm going to try that. And then you go down that road and you're like, wow, had I not gone down that road, I never would have came into this. And so I just think there's great value in it. I've never been disappointed when I've done that. I might have gone down some road and went, you know what? That wasn't for me. But you know what? I now know that's not for me. I don't live with regret. That has built resiliency in my life and allowed me to be a much better and more comfortable person. And trying to get people to do that and open themselves up to that, is part of the message of find a way. And when they do that, and it's just them. I tell people all the time, I'm literally doing it in the reflection of a mirror, because you're the judge and jury. That's nobody else's responsibility or ability to judge. And don't ever let anybody do that. It's yours. And that's how you grow. And that's how you get rewarded with peace and joy and happiness and success.
Well, I love that, Merrill. I think one thing we talk about as a theme on this podcast is oftentimes the reflection in the mirror is the biggest competition. And I think that's one thing that just kind of hearing your passion, talk through the resiliency and just things you've overcome is why you resonate so well with people, because you're living testimony of what it takes to walk the walk and talk the talk. So let's fast forward. You're a 10th round pick with the Steelers. And I know you've talked about, resiliency and process through our podcast. Another theme that I know is probably very important to you, and no better locker room or fit organizationally to really represent what good culture looks like. Can you give our audience some perspective of day one walking into, the black and gold, the pride of Pittsburgh, just kind of from a culture standpoint, what your experience was like there, and kind of some more of the life lessons you learned through that journey?
Well, this is I almost have to pinch myself. I gotta pause for just a second as I reflect and go back to walking in the doors of Three Rivers. Now, I say Three Rivers. There might be some people going, "Whoa, what? What's Three Rivers?" Three Rivers was really everything began for the Pittsburgh Steelers. That was the stadium I played in. That was the stadium the 70s were developed and built in. So when you walked in the door, you saw the 4 Super Bowl trophies. So that's the first thing I see. So I walked into that. I've seen that as a kid, and to now walk by them was one thing. I walk in the locker room, and there's my name up. We find our lockers, and you had your name up on the locker, and I sat down. I was sitting there, and the equipment manager, Tony Parisi, came over to me and he said, "Hey, do you know whose locker this is?" And so first thing I thought was, "Oh man, I sat in the wrong place." So I turned around and I was like, "Oh, it's mine." And he's like, "No, this is Franco Harris's locker." So they gave me Franco Harris's locker. I then was sitting there for a second, and Donnie Shell comes in, who just went in the Hall of Fame a couple of years ago, who is the standard of safeties. Okay, it's not Ronnie Lott. Donnie Shell was before Ronnie Lott. That doesn't minimize Ronnie Lott. I played against Ronnie Lott. Ronnie Lott was a bad dude. But Donnie Shell was the greatest striker in the history of the game, and he is the standard. He lockered next to me. My roommate was Mike Webster. I'm sitting there, and here comes Joe Green in. Ironically, he's holding a Coke can, which is the greatest commercial ever. Why is it the greatest commercial ever? It told a story. That's what makes it the greatest commercial ever. And then I get into the huddle for the very first time, and there's John Stallworth. And then, of course, the guy who led us all was Chuck Noll. And then, names you may not know of, but are legends in the Steeler organization, Dick Hoke, who played for like 11 years with the Steelers and coached for 30, who was one of the greatest coaches to ever coach in the National Football League. So to have all of that, and then 2 days later, here comes Mel Blount with his hat on, cowboy hat, walking in the room, shaking everybody's hand. Couldn't be more pleasant, making everybody feel like they're a Pro Bowler, versus and a game changer like he was, and still a friend to this day. So that was like the first mini camp that I experienced. And you got to understand what the standard was. In 87, those that don't know, the chief his name was the chief, Art Rooney, the dad who started he was called the chief. Well, he was still alive when I was drafted. And his very first meeting with the team, he didn't say anything about football. He talked about one thing. He talked about how we were woven fibers of the community as the Steelers. We work with the community. We give back to the community. That's what we're about. Now, he didn't say anything about winning a championship, playing great football. He said nothing about that. And then Chuck Noll, after that was done, stood up and said, now, don't just go run around thinking any charity is a good charity. Tie yourself to people that are credible. And like that principle is probably one of the most important principles, not just in charity work, in life. Tie yourself to people that are credible. Be around people that are credible, accountable, sustainable. And I've never forgot that very first meeting. So like that first week still resonates in my head. And those relationships, still work and have extended still to this day. And I've watched the chief to Mr. Rooney to Art and Dan Rooney Jr., who run the team today, which were his grandkids. So it's been a fascinating evolution and growth and watching those guys evolve. The franchise, though, stays the same because the fiber of all of those guys are the same. Integrity, great integrity. I think one of the greatest aspects of leadership are being consistent, number one, and they have consistent things of great value, but then how they model themselves. Like modeling is one of the most powerful things. I don't care what your leadership role is. That is one of the most powerful things. You can stand up and you can say all you want. You can pontificate and make things sound incredible. And then you go do something that's a complete antithesis of that and people watch that. That's what they're going to see. But if you mirror what you just said, powerful things come. That's what the chief was. The chief talked about all these, we're part of the community. I'm sitting there going, I'm 21. I'm like, what? I'm like, he didn't say anything about football. I'm like, but I didn't forget it. Right. And then I watch him. Sure enough, man. I mean, he's walking to the stadium, walks to his house, talks to people, part of the community. I'm like, wow. Then I saw it. And I was like, wow. So modeling is, that I've always known it, but that probably was the greatest example of how the power in it.
Well, it kind of reminds me of that old cliche also, Merril, iron sharpens iron. Kind of surround yourself with those that you want to continue to model. We talk about on the show also how magnets often attract in life. And it sounds like just the names that you mentioned and the leaders you were around, you were able to kind of soak up their wisdom, their mentality, the way they not only, talked it, but walked it. So for our audience, I think those are, really big themes that continue to not only scale your voice now, but have landed well on others that you've been around. So really appreciate you sharing, that type of mindset and giving our audience just a glimpse inside the four walls of what creates champions, which is what Steeler Nation is known for. But let's pivot a little bit, Merril, because we've talked a lot about, the glitz, the glamour, the touchdowns, the raising the trophies that obviously you've been a part of. I want to take you back to the year 1994, and you're playing against Kansas City. And it seems that was a point even within your career where, concussions and was not near at the forefront, right, as it is today. Part of which probably a testimony to all the relevance that you created through some of your injuries. But give our audience, Merril, some perspective of that day and time when, your career really probably changed due to some injuries.
Well, that day actually gets misunderstood a lot. People go, "Oh, concussion ended your career," and I'm like, actually, incorrect. If a concussion would end my career, I would never played after that Monday night game in Kansas City, which I did. I played for almost half a dozen games more the rest of that year. What ended my career was improper care, which is still the biggest concern and hurdle that exists today. Listen, the leading cause of head trauma in the entire country is tripping and falling. The most dangerous environment where that's probably going to happen is your home. So before you go, well, my kids aren't going to play contact sports because that's happened a lot because of just unfortunate fear and a lot of ignorance that with this messaging that has taken place. We have lost what is really powerful with head trauma. Nobody wants to have head trauma. I don't care what environment we're in. We want to protect our kids. I'm a dad. I'm a grandfather. I'm a poppy. So I don't want my kids to hurt them. Although I know you cannot avoid that in just life's journey. Nobody can say you're not going to slip in the shower and hit your head or fall off the trampoline or trip and fall. I mean, just you can't predict those things. It's better to understand if it does happen, what do you do? So I go back to what happened in 1994. Now, keep in mind, the Steelers had already implemented a cognitive test and get a baseline before the season. It's the first time in the history in our world, in any environment, but specifically in sports, it was ever done. The Steelers and football were the first ones to ever do anything for it, to initiate something in a proactive manner with a protocol. Anybody else can say they started stuff or that they've influenced it. It started in 1991 with the Pittsburgh Steelers. I was a part of that very first group of players to do it. Now, because it was individualized, the Bears did not have that baseline. So I go back to care. Now, here's one of the most important aspects of head trauma. If you're a parent and you're listening to this, it's not just in sports, in any environment. The most important thing is to identify and remove immediately. Like that is the most important aspect of head trauma when it happens. And that does fall on the responsibility of the players. So we educate players. And I coached youth football for a long time. In 2003, I had the first protocol ever implemented in youth sports. Even though it was just in the Fort Thomas area, it was implemented there. And part of that protocol was educating players. Listen, if you take a hit and you have a headache, well, there's only one person who knows you have a headache. That's you. So it's better for you to remove yourself and tell me as a coach. And then my responsibility is you're not going back and you're not going to play the next week because keep in mind, this is around 2003 when the things that exist today don't exist. That's 20 years prior to 10 years prior to a lot of protocols being started. But that initial aspect of head trauma is the most important aspect. Then it's the proper evaluation of that injury, however severe it is, and the proper care and treatment before they return to play, which exists today. So and I talk to parents. I'm talking to all the parents out there, the ones who have kids, and even from your own perspective. When we do that, when you do it properly, your return to play, you return in a much safer environment when we do all of those steps properly. And there is no science that if you have concussions or you have some type of head trauma as a youth, you're going to have a disease later in life. There is no scientific evidence to support that. Zero. Does that mean you can't have symptoms and you can't have cognitive behavior and issues? No. But that does not mean you're getting a brain disease later in life. There is no evidence of that. I don't care what you hear from Boston University. All of their science is garbage. And all they have to do to verify that is read it. And people never read the scientific literature. I've read all the scientific literature. Now, I can't help that they lie about their literature. And that's disturbing, especially the people who have an MD on the back of that, because they signed a Hippocratic oath to do no harm. And they have deliberately hurt and violated that, if not crucified that Hippocratic oath by doing harm to people, by lying about their science and throwing fear into parents and fear into people. It's about care, and there's proper care, and there's all kinds of incredible treatments that are available. My son went through something very similar to what happened in my career. This kind of tells you how far we've evolved. At 15, his first concussion was slipping in a shower and hitting his head. Okay, so it wasn't even in a football arena. But he had a couple of concussions, which they removed him properly, but they didn't have the right treatment and care at BYU that that I had access to. So I took him up to UPMC and we got him on a treatment and care program. And here's part of his treatment and care. There's a physical component and a cognitive component. And part of that physical component is active movement. It's not laying dormant. Like if you ever hear anybody go, "Oh, we just put them in a dark room or we shut them down," I will tell you this: they are prehistoric. That is not what you do. There's almost no head trauma, especially in sports, that requires that. In fact, you need to be active and you need to be doing cognitive things. He was doing things visually and physically to repair. The vestibular area is usually the area that has been affected the most. So repairing that and doing the proper treatment. Man, I'm telling you, within about 7 days, I watched the clarity come back to him, the recovery come back in him. And then when he returned back to play, well, shoot, he was at no higher risk than before because he had done things in a proper manner. So doing things in a proper manner and evaluating people when that happens, and the removal aspect, that's the most important. I emphasize that because we messed that up. And we let them play the next week versus being properly evaluated before they return back to play. So if you do all those things, it's actually the greatest time to ever be playing in sports history. And that, unfortunately, is declining because of the misinformation and the absolute ignorance and the fear of it versus understanding that head trauma could happen anywhere. It's better to know what to do and how to handle it and how to care and repair. And if we do that, then our kids should be active and involved in as many things as they want to be and not be in fear about if they're going to have head trauma. Try to do the best to avoid it. But if it's not avoided, there's ways to go about treating it and caring for it properly.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that, Merril. And one thing we talk about on the show also is, and I'm a big believer in this as well, everything always happens for a reason. And I think that theme stems back to you finding a way. You used kind of that situation that occurred to you as a player, and now continue to be a big voice that I know myself, even as a parent, and all our listeners really appreciate the passion and you really challenging the science and creating avenues and comfort for parents to want their sons, daughters, et cetera, to be a part of contact sports. And the life lessons we've already talked about speak for themselves that you learned through it. So thanks for sharing that. And hopefully I didn't bring up any bad memories of the Kansas City game, but man,
let me just add one thing to that. I wrote a book called Brainwashed, and that's a really powerful book to help people. I read all the scientific literature, and I think people have to understand and kind of clean up. My career did resume after that game. I didn't finish that. What happened though is I got returned to play. Think about this: in 1994, I got cleared over the phone, and all I was asked is one question: "How do you feel?" And I had a raging headache. I felt terrible, but back then they didn't tell you all those symptoms. You had to report those. Like I wasn't going to miss practice because I had a headache. Who would have thought that? All right, okay, but that's a major symptom. Now, I think most everybody should know that. Doesn't mean they do, but we try to emphasize that is a symptom a player has responsibility to share. Well, that wasn't ever told to me to share. So I said I felt great. And I'm back playing 5 days later. And I couldn't remember who I was or where I was for some 12 hours, which tells you the severity that I had in the Kansas City game. So I'm back to playing 5 days later. I had no business being on that field. Who knows? It could have been 5 weeks later based on what we knew in 94. Those things missed. That's why I go back to care. So improper care, improper evaluation cost me my career. If I was playing in today's world, oh my gosh, who knows? It's a few weeks, a month maybe, but my career's not over because of all the treatment and rehab. And the book, I just shared that because that would help parents understand the real facts. Because I went and read all of the science that Boston University has written. And what was really disturbing about that is what their science says is not what they say in the media. And then it's disturbing from a journalistic perspective that the journalists are so grotesquely incompetent, they don't go actually read the scientific literature after they get an answer to a question and then go, hey, wait a minute, that's not what your literature says. Why would you lie? Spectrum of Disease paper. Ann McKee says, who authored this scientific paper, who's an MD, by the way, because I got to believe after doing this research, all football players have CTE. So she says, the literature, the scientific literature that she authored, that she wrote, the conclusion says Caution must be used. You cannot use this research to give any sense of degree of CTE. It says it in there. She wrote it. But that's not what she told the media, and that's not what the media printed, and that's not what the headline goes. In fact, that headline still runs out there based on what she said. And she signed a Hippocratic oath to do no harm. That's deplorable and harmful to people at the highest level. And it's appalling to think that happens. Listen, if I'm a parent and I don't know all the things that I know and have lived, well, shoot, I'm going to protect my kids too. I don't blame them. But now you just mentioned it. There are so many kids who are born to play football, play contact sport. There are many that are not too, and they play baseball and basketball and all other sports. But to rob your kid of an opportunity to grow and evolve and learn things that are going to be beautiful for them in life, and to rob them of that out of just fear and ignorance is why I wrote the book, is to give parents an opportunity to look at. I'm not about changing your mind. Okay. Nobody has that right. But to open your mind to all of the actual facts and evidence that exist that are the truth. Now, you still may want to say, my kids aren't playing contact sports. That's your choice. But at least you did it with an open mind and you have all the information versus you saw something on the evening news and you believed it. And then you think you're doing something to benefit your kids, when in reality, you might be robbing them of the opportunity to learn and grow and go somewhere that they never would experience without that experience.
No doubt. And I would encourage all of our audience to not only tune in to the Brainwash book you referenced, but you're also Find a Way book to really, it encapsulates, right, your journey, your mindset, just the spirit you've lived by, as two great reads for not only themselves, but probably a lot of life lessons for the kids as well through that. So thank you for touching on that, Merril. Kind of as we digress into the next sector of your life, I think for all of our audience that has known you and is really getting a sense behind the curtain of how you operate, when you went into the media environment, you were probably and still are one of the most well-respected voices because you call it like you see it. You've been in the trenches, so when you speak, a lot of folks listen, and it gave you a platform to really, create more awareness, create more, education to the game. Can you give our audience some perspective of, you were used to playing under the lights, now you've got the light on you as a big-time NFL analyst. What was that like?
Well, I'll tell you what kind of drove me in that arena. I had played, it was 1989. We had started out horrendously. I think we got beat a combined 91-0 by Cincinnati and Cleveland. We are considered the worst team maybe in the history of the National Football League to ever start a season. We then have to rally. There's a long story to this. People remember the 1989 season, which we make it to the playoffs, by the way. We almost go to the Super Bowl. But that being said, we had to rectify and change things that next week. If we don't win, we got no shot probably of making a turnaround. So it's got to start with the Minnesota Vikings, who are 2-0. And we go into this game and we go in with an audible system. An audible system is quarterback comes up the line of scrimmage. He looks at the defense and we run the ball based on where we think our strengths are, their weaknesses are. Well, it just happened to be, and we had drafted Tim Worley as our first round draft pick from Georgia that year. And, he's the equivalent of Herschel Walker. But when we went to the game, I got more of the carries. I had a big game. We end up winning. Okay. Well, this guy, one of the media guys, wrote this most abusive article about me. He was like, how could you ever? He used car comparisons. He's like, why would you ever give the ball to a gremlin when you have a Ferrari in the backfield, basically, right? And it was an absolute, just brutal, ignorant attack. I'm like, this guy didn't even come in the locker room. He didn't even come over to my locker. If he had just asked a question, we could have shared what was going on. This wasn't by grand design. We're like, hey, you know what? Yeah, we're not going to give the ball to Tim Worley. The defense told us who we were giving the ball to. Anyway, he's the only guy I confronted. I just thought it was absolutely atrocious that you're going to write an abusive, attackful. Listen, it was one of the hardest articles I've ever read about myself. It's like, with just on 100% ignorance and absolutely no knowledge whatsoever. Didn't do anything. He just made an observation and then went about attacking. I'm like, you know how unfair that is? And that's the only guy I ever confronted. And I basically told him, I go, in your profession, I think you owe it to at least come talk to the person that you're going to beat up. At least ask some fair questions and have some information before you do that. I would think that's your responsibility. And that's kind of what sparked it, is that I started realizing, especially writers, they can write whatever they want. They're not held accountable. They can make things up. And people go, "Oh, we got editors." Nah, bull. Because if there was an editor there, they would ask a lot of those questions. Okay, the editors can be just as bad. But what it did for me was just like, it sparked me like, if I some other things led me over into media. This was not the only one, but this one sat in the back of my head. And I realized once I started working in the media and I started working at ESPN, I realized there was two things I will always do. I will never make an evaluation on a team or a player, good or bad, without watching tape. I will never take TV lies and highlights really lie. You can never tell what is truly going on a football field by watching the game. You can never know. And it's too fast, too many changes. You cannot tell. That's why as players, we watch tape. That's why one game can take us 3-4 hours to get through just one side of the ball, just to watch all of the details and components that exist in any given game. That's how you understand tendencies and all these nuances and the details of a team, the details of a player. It's the only way that you can possibly know it. Now, that takes time, and that is a lot of work, and it is not easy. But I made a commitment that if I ever make an assessment, I will do that. Even if I don't understand some tape, because there's sometimes you're like, they're doing some things conceptually I don't quite understand. I have the responsibility to find out whether it's a call to a coach or coordinator or a player to understand some of the details that I may not be understanding from that. And that is how I chose to do television. One time I made an evaluation of a player, and it was the biggest mistake I ever made on television. Maurice Jones-Drew on the draft day. I'd watched all these players. I had never watched Maurice Jones-Drew. He ends up getting drafted higher than people had predicted. And we came out of commercial break, and they gave me all these statistics. They gave me his height, weight. He was 5'8", like 220, whatever it was. And I immediately went, okay, he's a third down back. All right. I just assessed and assumed just based on his size. I made that assessment on his size and how the NFL is played. Well, I think Maurice Jones-Drew almost led the league in rushing like 5 years or something. He was a rolling ball. I mean, he was a great player. If I had watched any tape on him, I would have seen that. But I made an assessment. There's a long story behind that where Maurice Jones-Drew and I actually meet some 5 years later. It being a funny story. We're playing a DirecTV flag football game, and he was the official. And he was in the green room, and I could tell he was looking at me, and he walked over.
He didn't run you over, did he?
Well, I'm telling you, I was so uncomfortable. I was like, I know what he's thinking, And he's like, girl, on draft day, everybody's killing me. And when they come to you, I'm like, okay, this guy, he'll save me. He knows. And you did the same thing. And I'm like, Maurice, you are exactly right. And I'm going to tell you this. The day that happened, I have never done that again because I never watched any tape on you. I didn't know anything about you. I took some statistics. I took a size, and I just assumed. And just so you know, I deserve everything you're about to give me. And it was a joke. I know you're going to throw a bunch of penalties on me in this particular game, but it's just this story of like, I never did that again. I'll get asked a question. If I haven't seen tape on them, I'll just say I haven't seen tape. I can't tell you. I can't make up stuff, and then listen, when it's not good, that's when you really have to be buttoned up. You have the truth and evidence of the truth. People aren't going to like some things that you say because especially if it's a constructive way, or especially in the draft when you got players in college, people get used to, well, they won a national championship, they won a Heisman Trophy, so they can play in the NFL. It's irrelevant. That is irrelevant. Or they're a good guy. It's a bonus, but it's not a skill set. Now, he's exciting. Not a skill set. It's a bonus, but it's not a skill set. There's certain skills sets that belong in the NFL. And sometimes kids that, even though they played in the SEC, they just don't have it, and the fan is hard to understand that sometimes. That's just because they don't get to see tape and they don't realize. I mean, most people don't even know this. The college field is different than the NFL field. And you might have some people going, well, why, how's it different? The hash marks, like in college, they're wide. And that's why college is played on the perimeter. In the NFL, they're narrow. And so that's why it's played in the middle. And my guy is as good as your guy in the NFL, whereas in college, 80% of the time, I'm better than you. Every day I line up, We're better than those guys. Doesn't matter what they do. That doesn't happen in the NFL. I could care less what their record is. So there's just so many different variables, and that's what sparked me. And I've done that, and I'm so grateful I've stayed true to that. Aside from that, what Maurice Jones drew, I've stayed true to that, and it's never let me wrong, because I've listen, it doesn't mean you're always right, but from an assessment aspect, you've used all the tools to give a fair, honest evaluation.
Well, I think the audience appreciates that, Merril, and that's what you're known for. You made one comment there. They have it. And it is something that I think you can't put your finger on it. You can, some have it, some don't. But as we kind of close, one thing I know you've always had is the ability to inspire, number one, but overcome situations and take negatives into positives. And when we talk about unlocking the it factor on our podcast, I think the thing that you're doing that's probably the most relevant outside of sports and all the accomplishments you had in the sports, the media, is your experience as a cancer survivor is now making international impact on kids, adults, people of all ages. For myself personally, I'm in the cancer space in the corporate arena. Advocates like yourself are driving extreme awareness for evolving therapeutics and just things to do to innovate care. Can you give our audience, Merril, some perspective of when you were diagnosed, what that thought process was like, and how you not only overcame cancer, but now are impacting others with your story?
Well, I'll be very honest. When my doctor called me, it was on Valentine's Day, February 14th, 2003. I'll never forget the call. He said, "Merril, you got a malignant tumor, about 3 pounds, ironically the size and shape of a football." He goes, "I don't know if that matters." He goes, "But it's interesting. It's the size and shape of a football." He said, "You're going to go through brutal chemotherapy because you're no longer going to feel like the basketball league I was playing in and training like I was doing." He said, "Because you're going to be sick and tired." And he said, anywhere from 14 to 17 days after your treatment, you're going to lose your hair. You might want to think about shaving your head before. And the last thing, he goes, "I don't want to say it, but I got to say it." He goes, "I can't guarantee what we're going to do will work for you." And he hung the phone up. Now, two things overwhelmed me, if not consumed me on that day. And it was just chemotherapy and dying. The only movie I'd ever seen that was a cancer movie was Dying Young. And that's the first thing that reflected in my head. It was that awful movie and the brutality of chemotherapy. And I lost my mom when I was a young kid, and I understand the sting of death. I have kids. I love my kids without end. My parenting role, I think parenting role, if you have kids, it's the greatest role. It's the greatest leadership role you'll ever have. I don't care what company you run or how big it is. It's the greatest leadership role you ever have. And that became my focus, actually. Now, I didn't lose the thought process, chemotherapy and dying, quite honestly. It had overwhelmed me, consumed me. I call it the dark days of diagnosis, because that wasn't just the dark day. There was many to come that would just lead up to the real brutality of that call. But here's where I found hope. I've used Find a Way, actually becomes a parenting tool. My kids walk in my office and I hear, "Hey, Dad," and I get A. They want to do B, A or B, or so they got something they're dealing with. I'm like, "Okay, well, let's find a way." Because I like to get them thinking about, I go, this is yours. Try to get them to take ownership on it and think of how would you handle that? Now I'm going to guide them. I like to be them, but I always like to, spin it back on, this is yours. So what do you think you need to do to get this? Or what do you got to do to overcome this? And I've always learned from that, because kids are fascinating. But it's a parenting tool. So after I shared it with my kids, it was really my daughter, who was 9 years old at the time, who had come across the room, and I don't know how long she was in my lap. I'm telling you, I was so caught up into chemotherapy and dying. I couldn't focus on anything. She got my attention, and she says, "Well, then, you know what, Dad, you need to find a way." And I'm telling you, yeah, I actually, really, my spine still lights up when I say that, because, man, like that day, I was like, oh my gosh, like age 12, I shift right now. I'm like, change my mindset. I'm like, oh my gosh, like being sick and tired and laying on a couch, feeling sorry for myself, not an option. Dying, not an option. Going bald, that was still going to be an option, but who cares, right? And I'm like, I went in my office, tore down all my goals. I put the one thing up that is still, I tell when I do a lot of speaking, I ask people the most critical aspect of how we're going to function in our world is, do you control your mind or does your mind control you? Well, my mind was controlling me. It was racing me through every dark alley and dark scenario you could possibly imagine. Tore those goals down. I wrote one goal down. That would sit there for nearly 2 years. I will destroy non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. I still light up when I say that, because I mean the energy that comes in me, the fight that I have when I say that, I put that up on my wall and I'd look at it every day where I start and end my day. And that's where I started to control my mind. I was in charge now. I talked to 5 people who have been through what I'm about to go through. I talked about finding hope in people. Those 5 people, yes, they confirmed the brutality of the journey. They shared things with me like, hey, Merril, you're going to wake up one day and you're going to have burn holes all over your body. And I'm like, what? And it happened. And I was like, I was like, the hair loss, how toxic buildup, all that did happen. But you know what? I had been, and this is probably the hope I want to give people. There's 2 things that are in our control at all time, okay, that are going to help us no matter what comes our way. 1, invest in your health. I've been investing in my health my entire life. I'm like, oh my gosh, thank goodness I have it. I can use it. And 2, early detection. Listen to your body. I mean, this has happened struggles with a lot of males. They're like, oh, I don't need this. I don't need that. Go. Listen, you may not think you need it, but somebody loves you and wants you around. Go do it for them. Just get an annual physical. Do your follow-ups. Do all the tests that you're supposed to. Because I got this early. Think about that, 3-pound turmoil. I caught it early. There was no symptom that drove me there. If I'd have waited for a true symptom, it made it probably too late. So early detection, vital. All of those are in your control. And if you do those 2 things, whatever may come your way, I'm telling you, you got a better chance of surviving it with those 2 things on your side than them not to be on your side. Because I actually been through, I said, dark days of diagnosis. I spent almost a week getting tests done to verify I was in good enough shape to withstand what I'm about to go through. The nurse told me I wanted to do something on my heart. And I'm like, oh man, I think they got the wrong. I go, I'm getting chemotherapy. I'm not doing heart surgery or anything. She goes, oh no. He goes, we're going to see if your heart can withstand what you're about to go through. I just told a 38-year-old, which I was 38 at the time, and he couldn't go through treatment because he wasn't in good enough shape. I was like, what? And just think about that. If somebody tells you, well, haven't invested in your whole life, you can't run down to Target and pick it up now. It's too late. The value of investing in your health and early detection, such a pivotal aspect. But my daughter, that day that she challenged me, that energy change, that focus, how I went about approaching it. And, aside from losing my hair, I stayed playing in that basketball league. I got up every morning and trained like I would do before I got my kids ready for their day. I kept my routine, which one of the ladies I talked to who spoke of how brutal the treatment was, she was like, Merril, let me give you a piece of counsel. Keep your routine. Whatever your routine is, Merril, keep your routine. She goes, I kept my routine. I played checkers with my friends. I did this, I did that. And that was probably the best piece of advice that I got from somebody who had been through what I'm about to go through. But I found hope in them. I hung it up, as brutal as it was. I hung up the phone with them. I'm like, gosh dang it, they survived. Like that gave me hope. I'm like, holy cow, they did it. And that's what I try to help too with, like, you can do it. Okay. And find hope in people, find that spark and then use it. Now you got to go apply it. You're the one that's got to do the work and take the action, but do it. That's our responsibility, our personal responsibility to ourselves. There's no greater personal gift you can give to yourself than to give everything you got out of your God-given abilities. If you do that, have peace.
Well, I love it, Merril. I think for our audience, just getting a glimpse into your mindset, the passion you continue to live with, and congrats on obviously overcoming that diagnosis. I think the journey you've been on is put you in a position to continue to impact. Can't thank you enough for kind of sharing those testimonies and a glimpse into the life lessons that have made you what you are and continue to be. One thing we like to end in closing with, Merril, that I think will really resonate with you: we rise, we grind, we shine, we impact. I'm going to add one more thing for you. We find a way to win the day. Thanks so much, Merril Hoge, for joining us. I think this is the only time that you might have someone with a better double Windsor on than you, but man, continue to win, and I can't thank you enough for joining.
Well, I love it, and I love that tie. I was going to mention, I love that tie in the call. It looks awesome, brother.
Well, I look forward to following your journey, Merril, and thanks for impacting and continue to win the day.